Hello and welcome to Journalists Hangout UK, the show where we discuss issues both African and worldwide which are affecting the continent. And we look at how those issues are seen at home and in the African diaspora. I'm Vuiswang Ngubongwana, and I'm very pleased to welcome our panel today, Priscilla Nwigbo, a public affairs analyst, Lanre Akinola, the editor of African Business, and a warm welcome for the first time to Femi Okutubo, publisher of the Trumpet newspaper.
Thank you.
Gentlemen and lady, thank you so much for joining us. If I may start with you first, Femi, thank you so much for joining us. The Trumpet newspaper blowing good news across Africa, hopefully, but not so much good news with regards to the security challenges that we're facing on the continent. Now, you've probably had a quick skirt around the dilemma that Cyril Ramaphosa is facing. It's like he's really under siege at the beginning of his tenancy. How do you see what has happened with his decision to take over a whole region to try and resolve its own mismanagement, but then he got diverted by more violence in KwaZulu-Natal? What do you think is going on there?
Well, I think what you have happening in South Africa is a reflection of underlying problems that have been there for a while. When you look within the African National Congress itself, you'd notice that obviously there have been issues over the last number of years. Now, looking at the northwestern province itself, what you now have is a situation where there's actually a breakdown in services. Yes. There's been allegations of corruption, and when you know, those are things that would probably lead to a situation where you've got people who are restless, if you've got people who are unemployed, if the services are not there, you know, to the extent that water supply is short, electricity supply is short, you know, basic amenities of life are almost, you know, are in short supply. That is bound to have some form of reaction, and that's what we see playing out in.
And if I could bring you in, Larry, do you think the government, central government response to just push aside the local structures and seek to take over is a positive thing?
It's probably a necessary thing rather than a positive thing, or they would have perceived it to be a necessary step. Is it particularly helpful in the short term? No, but the number one priority has to be providing security. That is the baseline for all economic development or social development.
Sure.
In the absence of security, you know, you can't do anything. So I would say it's necessary. What's important is what they do next, how they actually implement, implement this direct rule, how long it's going to take, and what the plan is to, to hand power back over. So, necessary, but let's see what happens.
How do you think it might manifest, Priscilla? Because it's a first within African governmental systems, certainly since post-colonialism, as far as I'm aware.
Well, I think they have two choices. Like Lanre says, it's an opportunity, first and foremost, to provide security for the people within that region. And it's an opportunity for them to do better than what, to avoid the mistakes, as it were.
Yes.
South Africa is renowned for its state of violence. Although, it's still managed to be, the most successful African country, as it were. But it still needs that serious stem on some of the violence that is taking place. And with these violence that we're speaking about today, it's not just an issue of today. It's been going on for quite a while.
Absolutely, because since 1994 in KwaZulu-Natal, over 450 people have been killed.
They are, and these are assassinations. These are political assassinations that we're speaking of. And I think that is a very, very serious area where the government needs to employ whatever arsenal that they have to stem the situation before it gets out of hand.
And also, Femi, do you think, looking at the killings in the KwaZulu-Natal area, part of it could be a response to, well, basically the disgrace on Zuma's legacy?
I think I'll agree with you to a large extent on that, but I think at the root of it all is the fact that obviously you've got different people with different political interests who are trying to settle political scores. And it's all about power, people wanting to be in a position of power.
But do you think these are, let's be fair, let's put this in context. We're talking about just over 20 years. Nigeria's had over half a century. So South Africa is the relatively new democracy. Do you really think it would be fairer to assess this as part of the natural growing pains of a new democracy?
No, I disagree. I don't think it. I don't think it should. And I would even think that South Africa, because of what it has, gone through, in the past in terms of apartheid, I would have thought that that should be one thing that should even bring the country closer together, to be able to work together and also sort of try and play catch up, as it were, with some of the lost glory that that it lost.
But then it's difficult, viewers, I'm sure, many of you may be aware that there is a lack of confidence within the police, and that it seems that security is moving to more private sectors, and that does seem to be a dilemma, particularly if you look at the situation in Nigeria with regard to its own internal security, Lanre. We've really had to take really good cognizance of the depth of the corruption within the Nigerian security sector. Damning reports are being put out, thankfully, because we are in a democratic area, about the depth of the corruption within the security sector in Nigeria. South Africa has no confidence in its police. It's being taken over by private firms. Is similar thing due to happen in Nigeria?
Well, instability and insecurity is also an opportunity, depending on where you're coming from. There is this famous quote, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And while insecurity negatively affects the ordinary citizen, it is, of course, an opportunity for mercenaries, it's an opportunity for politicians, and insecurity is always going to be exploited by political interests. And I'd like to echo what Femi said earlier. This ultimately comes down to social and economic development issues. That is the root cause of this, which isn't helpful in the short term, because in the short term you just need to make sure people are not dying.
Right.
But it is absolutely paramount at all times that ultimately what you have to achieve is some sort of meaningful addressing of underlying economic conditions. That's what breeds insecurity, and that's what opens the door to corruption, opens the door to political manipulation, opens the door to mercenary armies being brought in, etc., etc.
And I don't think you'd ever disagree with that in essence, Priscilla, but it does seem the focus seems to be on the military. We heard President Trump, promising lots of money. In fact, I believe it's been delivered. So really the focus is on a military solution, come what may. What do you think will happen?
Military solution by whom? The focus is on the military. It depends on which angle we're looking at it. It's on the military because President Trump stands to make a lot of money for America with the deals and the agreements that he has with Nigeria. It's not that much in
the context of U.S. arms deals. Right? Let's not exaggerate.
I'm not exaggerating, but
it's not that much.
But if we don't allow the good crisis to go to waste, it's because some people are going to make money selling weapons. And on the other hand, I think the problem of the increase that we have on the continent, be it South Africa, be it Nigeria, it's a simple case of lack of justice.
Of course. And that's the case with the herdsman issue that seems to be going
lack
nowhere.
Of justice. There isn't any justice. For instance, in South Africa, when we're speaking of these political assassinations, nobody's being brought to book. There is no real investigation, and those who are committing these crimes tend to get away with it. So it's on the increase. We see the same thing in Nigeria. I think when our governments begin to sit up and understand the need for justice, the importance of being able to hold somebody accountable for failing to do their jobs, because what we have, the security agencies, fail to carry out duties, fail to do what they're there for. And nobody is asking them, why are you failing? Why were you not at your post? Or why were you not protecting the people?
For me, is this not true of all African governments? I can't find one that has actually been able to be accountable, honestly, to its people. And that's part of the process of struggling to create a democracy that works for African people. Would you say the Nigerian government currently is winning?
I wouldn't say the Nigerian government is winning, and because again, as far as I'm concerned, there isn't good leadership or good examples in terms of leadership from the top. What you even have is a situation where the leaders are saying, do this, and they're practicing something else.
Do you think, can I just interrupt a bit? Do you think part of the dilemma is that as fingers are being pointed and individuals are being called to book, the ones pointing the fingers also forget there are three pointing back at them because of their interconnection within the networks? Is that the dilemma, really?
No, I think it goes beyond that. Because again, if you look at present-day Nigeria, let's use the anti-corruption war as an example. It's very selective. You've got a government that had a number of functionaries from previous regimes who were in different political parties, but because they've now joined the ruling political party, they seem to enjoy some immunity.
Yes.
And that, as far as I'm concerned, that's the starting point.
for an ever decreasing cycle of things getting worse. I mean, a final word to you on this issue. Do you feel, I'll ask you as well, the winning question, because at the end of the day we're having an election soon. Is the government winning enough to have the confidence of its own people?
I would say there's a question before your question, which is what game is being played. And the answer to who's winning depends on what the game is. And that's a complex question.
Right, absolutely. and we'll be unraveling a lot more. But first, we're going to take a quick break now. We have so much more to discuss, so please join us in a few moments. Hello and a warm welcome back to Journalist Hangout UK. I'm Vuiswang Ngobongwana and I'm pleased to welcome back our panel, Priscilla Nwigbo, Lanre Akinola and Femi Okutubo. Wow, let's focus more on Nigeria. Now, you know that idea about the Sambisa forest. Have you read that?
I heard that and I just assumed it was fake news because that's a crazy idea.
What do you think, Priscilla?
Well, you know, I'm on the same page as Lanre because I thought, you know, somebody's got to be, was there a mistake with the wording? Terrorist, tourist. I thought there was a mistake somewhere.
Right.
But, you know, I think, though, that it would make a great grazing reserve. And just imagine if they would consider utilizing that for the cattle and then import the grass from the south. So just imagine the business there that could be, you know, that Nigeria could develop.
Right.
And that trade between the north and the south. So we use Sambisa forest and we import the grass from the south. And, you know, we would solve a lot of problems.
But if only there was more cooperation on every level between the north and the south, Femi, because really, if you really boil everything down to the root, that's what we're talking about.
I would even say that we should move the seat of government down there. Let's have the seat of government there for a couple of years as a unifying place between the north and the south.
Yes.
And you know, later on it can then become a tourist attraction.
Yes, yes. I mean, and it's also about maintaining that kind of thriving economic environment.
Yes, in the context of Nigeria, a lot of economic activity is concentrated in the south and especially around Lagos, but that is not unusual. In many countries, economies are skewed towards big urban centers. The problem in Nigeria is that it becomes a political issue. It is easily politicized, and that is when, you know, we lose sight of the economic dynamics here. Look at this country, the UK. The southeast dominates the economy, which causes its own problems. But it's, you know, I think that people sort of, we can't get too upset about that. It's an almost natural dynamic of any economy.
People will always go to the center,
exactly,
to the heart
where the cities are.
But from what you can glean, Priscilla, do you think it's driven by key individuals? I mean, Nigeria has a significant number of billionaires. Or do you think there's a general growing of an enterprise culture?
I think one thing that Lagos has had in its favor is that over a period of, you know, the recent government of Lagos have made it they've been very focused, they've been very clear about developing Lagos and making sure that Lagos stands as that modern day city. You know, there's been a focus-driven action to ensure that there is development in Lagos and that Lagos is a place where you come to and your business will succeed. I mean, there's a saying that if it doesn't work in Lagos, then it's highly likely not to work in Nigeria.
Anywhere.
So, you know, you've got to give them the credit for being so focused on driving that.
And being a good example. But also, I mean, we're talking about development in its broader context. It must have diversification, Femi, as you are aware. Do you feel there's enough of that? Because that's how most African economies have been held back, by a lack of diversification.
Well, in the case of Lagos and being the commercial capital of Nigeria, one thing I would say that we've witnessed is a situation where the internally generated revenue of the government has actually increased tremendously. Unlike relying on the center so much for its revenue or from the national cake, Lagos State has really done very well in terms of generating revenue internally, in terms of collecting taxes and so on and so forth. So that has helped in terms of diversifying its revenue base.
Right,
but again, I think we need to put the issue of Lagos in context. Much as I can see that there are a few things that are, that are happening in terms of infrastructures and so on, I also feel that there are certain areas that are not developing as as fast as the other parts of the state.
Sure.
So as far as I'm concerned, at the moment, there's a lot of emphasis on the island. In comparison to, say, for example, the mainland and the suburbs.
And and the rural areas, the agricultural development.
So you might not believe this, but having grown up on the mainland, I very much agree with you that there's a big disconnect within Lagos as well. We can't forget that. There are two Lagoses. One thing to say is that there are some efforts to try and bridge some of these gaps. Just this week, it was announced that a Chinese company has been awarded a $7 billion deal to help work on the Lagos-Kano Railway. Now, we can discuss the merits of that project and where it is, but it's hard to bridge these gaps. You mentioned rural populations, which are very much out of the loop here.
Well, I was going to ask you, are there any developments that give you cause for hope with regard to that?
Not in a sort of really systemic way.
Right.
We forget how big Africa is. We forget how big African countries are, and infrastructure is prohibitively expensive. Rural infrastructure is extremely hard. One encouraging area, though, is off-grid solar. There has been off-grid solar energy.
Off-grid solar.
Yeah. So that is solar energy that isn't on the main grid. That has started to attract sort of larger scale investment in recent months, and that has potential to have quite a significant impact on rural populations because there are positive externalities to solar energy. You can synergize that with telecommunications and other types of technologies which can address some development challenges.
Right, lots of interesting internal dynamics that perhaps we don't normally give enough sufficient focus to, Priscilla. So as we look at the broader international picture and we hear President Trump saying, come on, Buhari, more concessions on trade, which would be disastrous, bearing in mind the tender nature of these developing economic structures. What do you think of what he's asking for? And Buhari's resistance. Are you impressed?
I must confess, I do applaud him for resisting.
Yeah.
America is still trying to negotiate with the EU on this trade deal. I think, we do need to take a stand because the American negotiation wholly, favors America more than anybody else.
Yes.
And so, you must consider the impact of that trade agreement on your own economy.
Because I think a lot of people talk about it as though it was an even playing field to begin with. It wasn't, was it?
It's not always no. Whenever the US is involved, let's not kid ourselves.
Yeah.
Let's tell ourselves the truth. It's always about America. It's not about anybody else. It's about how everybody else will be subservient to America.
Is Nigeria different? I'm just going to throw it out there, yeah? Let's not be too one-sided here.
But I must give it to Mr. President for saying, let's put some brakes on this. But I also think that the economic problems of Nigeria, the lack of diversification it's nothing but a lack of commitment. And there's a degree of laziness and no planning, inadequate planning, because I think that if those who are in positions of governance would have taken into account and began to plan. Sustainable Energy for All was launched in Abuja, 2012 by the UN? We shouldn't be the ones that are lagging behind when we're speaking of solar power. We should be running with that.
Absolutely.
But
also,
because of lack of intention to plan.
And also being stuck to only looking to the West for any kind of assistance, and why would we get it from the people who colonized us?
That's not true.
But let me bring in Femi, because we are not just looking to the West, we're looking at China too.
And
I wanted him to speak.
Getting carried away with the East.
But are we striking the right kind of partnerships, Femi, do you think, with China, having learned from the difficult partnerships we have with the West, where we are eternally in debt?
That's a big problem. If those investments lead to a situation where the country itself, i.e. Nigeria itself, is growing and it's not one-sided and we're not just accumulating debt for the sake of, then it's a good thing. My fear is that when you now throw things into the equation, so when you throw things like corruption into the equation. You know, some of these deals that are happening, some of these projects, you know, does 100% of the revenue, or even most of the revenue, does it really go into the country, or are there deals behind deals that are going into private pockets? If that's the situation, then at the end of the day, what you're going to have is a situation where the country is not even better off for it.
And and certainly from the reports in the Tribune newspaper, some very damning information about the depth of the problem. Are you confident that we
I haven't read this report.
No, but are you confident that we can actually have more transparency whenever big amounts of money are...
Yes, we can.
Yeah?
It's unlikely to happen, but we can't, you know, you might not like this voice, but Africa has to stop just blaming the West.
No, this is not about just blaming the West, but it's understanding that our own internal structures have to be up to the mark.
That's exactly that's the real problem here,
Yes.
because Africa actually has never had it better in terms of negotiating options and, you know, and partnership options, and in Africa as well. Let's not forget that we are starting to see African countries integrate a little bit more. We're seeing the emergence of multinational African businesses that are expanding across the continent.
Yes.
The diversity of partnership has never been better.
Excellent.
What is lacking is the internal governance to negotiate properly.
Well, and on that positive note, I'm afraid time has actually caught up with us, and we have to end today's discussion on Journalist Hangout UK. Thank you so much for joining us. Many thanks to our guests for some insightful opinions, not always in agreement, but always terribly civilized. Thank you so much for joining us on JH UK.